Hi, and welcome to the Law Simplified. I'm Shavin Bandaranayaka. Today, we'll break down a question in relation to homicide.
Ian and Kate had been married for several years. Kate had suffered many years of violence and abuse from Ian and as a consequence suffered from severe depression. She was also diagnosed in her teenage years as suffering from a personality disorder which results in obsessive jealousy. One evening, whilst on his way out of the house, Ian insulted Kate, calling her hideous, and revealed that he was having an affair with her sister. This left Kate feeling very depressed, and she proceeded to drink half a bottle of whiskey. A few hours later, Ian returned and with a sneer told her that he had had a wonderful evening. Kate picked up the bottle of whiskey and, intending to cause him serious harm, hit Ian on the head with it. He died from the injuries sustained. Discuss Kate's liability for the homicide of Ian.
Now that we have identified and outlined the question at hand, much like many other subjects and many other questions that you will attempt in your LLB, it's a good idea to have a mental map and maybe highlight in your mind's eye what exactly you will be discussing. Now, based on this, let's have a look at the important facts that you will have to ascertain and then apply the law towards. Firstly, it's noted that Kate suffers from severe depression. She has been diagnosed in her teenage years as suffering from a personality disorder and has resulted, therefore, in obsessive jealousy. First and foremost, this is an ancillary piece of information, something that will help us gauge her liability later on. So mind this when we move forward. Next, Ian insulted Kate, calling her hideous, and revealed that he was having an affair with her sister. Now, the reason why we have been mentioned this is to create a correlative effect between her mental state as well as the information that she has been provided by her husband. Kate, feeling very depressed, proceeded to drink half a bottle of whiskey. Note that there has been a mention of alcohol consumption or intoxication, in other words. This will also impact liability later on. Ian returned home and told her that he had had a wonderful evening. Now, what's important in this particular piece of information is the fact that there is a gap between Ian mentioning to Kate that he is having an affair, going out on perhaps a date with this other individual, and then coming back and suggesting that he had a wonderful time. This is considered to be, on the one hand, a trigger, something we will talk about a bit later on. Kate, at this point, picks up a bottle of whiskey and, intending to cause him serious harm, hits Ian on the head with it. Now, this is the first time that we are indicated about a particular action or an actus reus, as well as the purported mental or the mens rea, the mental capacity that Kate had. Finally, because of these actions, Ian is stated to have died from his injuries. So, once we have identified these several facts which outline the question, the very next thing that we need to do is to identify what the issues are. So, firstly, has Kate committed homicide? And if so, does it amount to murder? Second, will Kate's subsisting condition, as in her depression, her personality disorder, affect her liability? And thirdly, are there any similar precedent case law that may indicate a different outcome? Now, for the perceptive among you, once you've outlined and once you understand this particular subsisting question and the scenario, it might indicate a particular case that has been decided in the past that may have deviated from the usual general norm that court was following. But we will identify that towards the end. Much like many other situations, the first thing that you need to do is hark back to your spider graph. What you see before you now is the spider graph that I used for my examinations when I was studying for the LLB, specifically criminal law. So it's a good idea to have a spider graph made for every major topic in any subject. So for instance, here we have a quick succinct spider graph that has outlined homicide, which is murder, manslaughter, which is voluntary and involuntary. From this point onwards, because of the branch structure, the very first thing you need to do is identify the relevant branches. The branches themselves in this spider graph will allow you to identify what you will need to discuss in order to establish liability as well as to complete the question at hand. So the first thing we need to identify is whether there has been a homicide in place. Absolutely, in relation to the facts of the matter, Kate is the direct causal link for what has taken place. She has hit Ian with the whiskey bottle, and that has in turn killed Ian. So the first thing we need to discuss is murder. Therefore, we need to exclude everything that is not relevant at this point. Once we have excluded all other aspects, the first thing you need to go through are the requisite elements of murder, namely the actus reus and the mens rea. So the definition of murder itself, which is found in common law in the case of R. M. Maloney, is that of an unlawful killing of a human being with the intention to kill or cause grievous bodily harm. We know for a fact that there has been an unlawful killing. Kate has no lawful means of killing Ian. So at this point, the actus reus is complete. However, there might be a question in relation to the mens rea, because the direct definition of murder, rather the mens rea, the mental element of it, is the intention to kill or cause grievous bodily harm. According to the facts, it neither states that Kate intended to kill nor cause grievous bodily harm. However, there is a specific case, that of R. and Saunders, which speaks about serious harm being equal to grievous bodily harm. Since the facts indicate that she intended serious harm, we might be able to state that the requisite mental element is also in place. So, subject to any other conditions, we could consider that Kate has committed murder. However, at this point, we need to start thinking about the secondary components, her mental state that is being subsisting in her for several years now. The depression, the personality disorder, the obsessive jealousy, so on and so forth. Now, the impact of these elements would be quite simply that a charge of murder will be relegated to either voluntary or involuntary manslaughter. Now, clearly the facts indicate that she was aware of her actions. She hit Ian with the whiskey bottle in order to cause serious harm. So it's difficult to consider it to be involuntary in nature. If so, it would be voluntary manslaughter. So the next element that you need to identify in our spider graph is that. So once we bring that about as well, you'll understand that there are two different types of voluntary manslaughter, one of loss of self-control and diminished responsibility, both of which have been identified in the Coroners and Justice Act of 2009 and the Homicide Act of 1957 respectively. Now, it's a good idea when you are answering questions of this caliber to weigh the pros and cons and determine where you should go with your answer. Now, clearly, the facts stipulate that Kate was obsessively jealous, she was depressed, and before these actions occurred, Ian had pretty much thrown her off the ledge by suggesting that he was having an affair, and once he came back, he had had a wonderful time. It's clear that there was some sort of trigger that made Kate do what she did. So for all intents and purposes, I would argue that this is voluntary manslaughter by virtue of loss of self-control. And the reason for this primarily is because one of the qualifying triggers, namely being seriously wronged, seems to have been fulfilled in this case. She had a mental capacity issue in terms of her jealousy, her personality disorder, as well as depression, and this seems to be one particular qualifying trigger. Now, this is one argument only. You are completely free to argue otherwise. The one reason why I will side with loss of control is because this is an evolution to a former charge of provocation. Now, earlier on in this discussion, I mentioned that there might be a precedent case which is similar in nature. And the case that I was referring to is that of R and Ahluwalia, where the concept of battered woman syndrome was brought in. Now, once again, this is one specific argument. Once you have identified all of these aspects, you would understand when approaching a question on homicide, the very first thing that you need to do is establish whether a homicide has occurred in the first place. Remember, none of the external ancillary elements of mental capacity about the circumstances matter. Motive comes last. The very first thing that you need to think about is whether the requisite actus reus and mens rea has been complete, whether the causal link has no intervening events occurring, who did what. From that point onwards, the only difference between homicide would be whether it amounts to murder or manslaughter. If you are interested in questions of this caliber, as well as how to approach them and how to properly answer them, and perhaps receive feedback on the types of questions that you're writing as well, make sure you visit law.simplybook.me, and I'd be glad to arrange a private tutoring session with you. So as always, have fun, stay safe, and obey the law. Cheers.